much to Lori and Mark, and especially to Robin for inviting me, and thank you for your interest, and it's been great to meet with you guys during the small groups and during office hours, and I'm including my email address on in the slides if folks have additional questions, or if other folks who I have not met during the small groups and office hours have questions that they'd like to reach out. I'm happy to meet online and talk through issues with your current or future projects. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about an ethical framework for clinical research that Robin actually led as part of the AAN's ethics committee, and that I worked with, and sort of walk you through the framework that was accepted and promulgated by the AAN in parallel with the NIH. In terms of my disclosures, just some foundational funding for our work. My hope for this is that by the end of this talk, you will be able to explain some key differences between clinical research on the one hand and clinical practice, and some of the additional ethical complexities that arise for clinical researchers as a result of those important differences. That you'll be able to summarize 7 commonly used principles in ethical analysis of research on human participants that are derived from the foundational documents of clinical research ethics, and that you'll be able to apply those principles to commonly encountered ethical issues and problems in clinical neuroscience research. And we'll look at 2 particular examples, being the replication crisis, which has already come up in some of the talks this week, and in addressing participants with impaired decision-making capacity, which I think is a common experience for many neurologic clinical researchers. So I want to start by talking about some important differences between clinical research and standard clinical care that I think it's really important to think about as you're expanding beyond clinical care into the field of clinical research. So clinical research is fundamentally work with human participants that is primarily, maybe not solely, but primarily intended to generate generalizable knowledge about human health and disease. In clinical research, the risk is going to be borne primarily by the participants, but benefits, because of this production of generalizable knowledge, extend not just to the participant, but also to the researcher, and in particular to society at large. And so the ethical issues are going to be significantly more complex than in clinical care, where the primary goal is the health and welfare of the individual patient, and where the individual patient is bearing both the risks and benefits for the most part. So as we set out as clinical researchers, we have a set of dual and at times conflicting ethical obligations that clinical providers, pure clinicians, do not have. And so on the one hand, there is a duty to the research participants to protect the interests of the research participants. But on the other hand, there is an additional duty to the society that funds, facilitates, and permits the research, and to the potential future beneficiaries of the knowledge generated in the clinical research. And these 2 obligations can at times come into conflict. And so a lot of clinical research ethics deals with sort of adjudicating between those potential conflicts. The therapeutic misconception, which has come up already this week, is a very common false belief that the primary goal of clinical research is the direct benefit to the participants in that research project, rather than the production of generalizable knowledge. And in surveys, the general public, of clinicians, and even of clinical researchers, the therapeutic misconception is very common. And this is a problem because it can lead to participants and also clinicians thinking that clinical research is more beneficial and less risky than it really is for the participants, and sort of disregarding some of the risks and uncertainty that goes with clinical research. So modern clinical research ethics really grew out of a number of foundational documents that were developed following the Holocaust, following World War II, and the Tuskegee syphilis experiments here in the States. So the first was the Nuremberg Code, which was developed during the trial of Nazi researchers in 1947, specifically to address the pretty horrific ethical violations that occurred during the Holocaust, and which were not actually in codes of law or ethics at that time. So there was this recognition by ethicists, physicians, researchers that major ethical violations had occurred, and that it wasn't entirely clear that there was a written code of ethics or code of law that demonstrated that violation. So the Nuremberg Code was sort of the first effort, and there's actually a lot of interesting ethical and legal debate about whether the Nuremberg trials were sort of a post hoc imposition of a code that didn't exist before the crimes. But that was sort of the first document that tried to formalize the ethical principles of research ethics. It was quickly followed by the Declaration of Helsinki, which was promulgated by the World Medical Association in 1964, and has been subsequently updated, most recently in 2024. The latest edition was published. And then a little bit later, the Belmont Report, which was developed in 1978 here in the States, specifically in response to the Tuskegee syphilis study. And that really established the distinction between clinical practice and research that we just mentioned. It proposed principles of beneficence, autonomy, and justice that are really have shaped modern bioethical theory, both in clinical practice and in clinical research. And it applied those principles to informed consent, to assessments of risk and benefits in research, and to the selection of research participants. It's been a really formative document, particularly in U.S. Clinical research ethics. And then finally, there's the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Common Rule, promulgated in 1991 and updated in 2017 and 2018, which sets standards for federally funded research in the United States, and has been endorsed and agreed upon not just by the Department of Health and Human Services, but also the Department of Education, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, NASA, CIA, innumerable federal agencies, and also by almost all academic institutions in the U.S., both those that rely on federal funding and also other academic research institutions even that do not receive federal funding. And so those are really the written rules that govern clinical research ethics in the United States. So the expectation that clinical researchers are going to read through all of these foundational documents, I think is not necessarily fair or widely accepted. And Ezekiel Emanuel is one of the sort of more influential medical ethicists currently practicing, developed a framework of 7 principles for the ethical analysis of research in human participants, drawing on and attempting to summarize the requirements in these 4 foundational documents: the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, and the Common Rule. And I think these 7 principles are an excellent heuristic, particularly for folks who are starting out in clinical research, and they form a really excellent foundation for discussions, debate, and analysis of ethical issues in clinical research. I think this is a really good starting place. Importantly, these 7 principles have been widely accepted and utilized over the past 2 decades, and they are explicitly endorsed by the NIH and the American Academy of Neurology. And as I mentioned, Robin Conwood actually led the position statement by the AAN, sort of promulgating and discussing these 7 principles. And if you're interested, there's a citation at the bottom of the slide where you can read more about the AAN's position on these 7 principles and some more detailed application of these 7 principles. And you can also use that citation if you want to cite these 7 principles in a discussion or a proposal. If you're making an argument or you're in a discussion with your local IRB or with a funder, a funding agency. The importance of principle-based analysis is not so much that it is a comprehensive encyclopedic review of all issues that can possibly arise in clinical research ethics, but it is a useful heuristic. It focuses attention on common ethical problems. It avoids unintentional oversight of common ethical vulnerabilities, and it provides a common starting point, a common language for interdisciplinary discussion between clinical researchers, ethicists, and others discussing and debating these issues. It's not to say that these 7 principles are accepted universally. There are definitely times where these principles come into conflict with each other, and there are definitely times, for example, during the COVID pandemic, where one or more principle have been subjected to significant debate and question. I'll point that out. So this is the summary table from the AAN's position statement that goes through the 7 principles, but I'm going to dive in a little more detail. And I'm going to go through these principles one by one. So the first principle is that of social value, which requires that in order to be ethically permissible, a clinical research study must have the potential to improve human health or meaningfully increase society's knowledge of human biology. And so an example of a violation of this principle would be a placebo-controlled trial of a Me Too medication that is no safer, no more effective, and no cheaper than existing medications for the same illness. Right? So even if a study is scientifically valid, involves informed consent, has been through IRB review, if there's no potential to advance our knowledge of biology or to improve the management of disease, the social value is lacking, and the study would not be justifiable based on this principle of social value. The second principle, and I think this is one where we've discussed a lot over the course of this week, is the principle of scientific validity. So in order to be ethically permissible, a study must use accepted scientific methodology to produce valid and reproducible results. And so the point here is, it's not just a scientific and epistemological issue if your research is not scientifically valid. It's also an ethical problem. The resources that are allocated to your research, and particularly the risks and uncertainty that your participants are encountering, are not going to be justifiable if you're conducting a scientifically invalid study. And so an example of a violation of this principle would be a study that uses unblinded and biased assessments of outcomes that systematically favor the study drug. But I think during the course of this week we've talked about a lot of ways that studies' scientific rigor and validity can be undermined. And the point of this principle is that addressing those issues is not merely a scientific challenge, it's also an ethical challenge, an ethical necessity, I would say. The third principle is that of fair participant selection. So in order to be ethically permissible, study sites, populations, participants must be selected based primarily on scientific criteria, and vulnerable populations must not be targeted or excluded in clinical studies. I think historically there was a lot more focus among clinical ethicists and clinical researchers on concerns about targeting vulnerable populations, but I think in recent years there's been a growing awareness that by far the more common problem in clinical research has been the unjustified exclusion of vulnerable populations, which has resulted in many vulnerable populations having limited data regarding their medical care and their clinical care. An example of a violation would be a study that it excludes female participants without an explicit and valid scientific rationale. It's not to say that you can never exclude a specific population, but there needs to be a valid scientific rationale for doing that. That needs to be explicit. The fourth principle would be favorable risk-benefit ratio. So in order to be permissible, a study needs to minimize risks to participants, and the potential benefits to the participants should exceed those risks. I will say this principle came under a lot of debate during the height of the pandemic, when there were thoughts of, when there were discussions of human challenge studies, studies where participants would be given a test vaccine and then intentionally exposed to COVID in order to accelerate the research. So the thought was that given the social need, that principle of social value might in that extreme circumstance might outweigh this principle of favorable risk-benefit ratio for the participant. Ultimately, human challenge studies were not pursued, but there was serious discussion about doing that, and I think that may arise again in future pandemics. An example of a violation would be a trial using a placebo control, even though safe and effective treatments are otherwise readily available to participants. But I think a human challenge subject would probably also be an example of a violation of this principle, and that was seriously discussed. The fifth principle would be that of independent review. So the idea that in order to be ethically permissible, clinical studies must be reviewed and approved by knowledgeable individuals unaffiliated with the research. This is usually, but not always, institutional review boards. And an example of a violation would be a study that's conducted either in a nation or an institution where the institutional review board is pro forma and where approval is guaranteed and where rigorous review is not conducted. I will say again, this is another principle that has been subjected to significant criticism. That there have been serious researchers and medical ethicists who have argued that the costs of independent review can in some cases outweigh the benefits. I think it's an area of ongoing debate. I will say that I think it's a position of the AAN, and I'm sure the NIH, though I can't speak for them, that the tradition of institutional review in the United States has led to, not a perfect, but generally speaking, a very strong safety record of clinical research in the United States, and for this reason, I think this principle is still widely accepted and endorsed, including by the AAN and NIH, and is required, of course, by the Common Rule. The sixth principle is that of informed consent. So participants must be accurately informed of and understand the purpose, risks, and benefits and alternatives of a clinical study, and make an uncoerced decision with decision-making capacity whether or not to participate. An example of a violation would be a study in which participants are not informed of existing effective treatments outside the study, and of course the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is the classic example of a violation in which participants were not informed of effective treatments for syphilis that were developed and became widely available during the course of that study. And then finally, the seventh principle is respect for enrolled and potential participants. And this is really where privacy protections come in. So this principle requires that in order to be ethically permissible, potential and enrolled participants must be treated respectfully with attention to and protection of their privacy and interest throughout the course of the study. And an example of a violation would be a study in which a study of a genetic test in which identifiable results could be obtained by employers or law enforcement. And so those are the 7 principles. I want to give a couple of examples of commonly encountered ethical problems in neuroscience clinical research, and sort of how these principles might guide recognition of those issues and might guide efforts to mitigate or eliminate these problems. So one problem that I think many of us encounter in our clinical research is the issue of cognitive impairment and the potential impact on decisional capacity. So Paul Applebaum, in his seminal New England Journal of Medicine article, defined decisional capacity as requiring necessarily 4 abilities. The ability to understand the basic facts of the decision, the ability to appreciate that the facts apply to oneself and one's own health and welfare, the ability to reason, to manipulate information about the decision, for example, weighing risks and benefits, and finally the ability to communicate a decision. And decisional capacity, importantly, exists on a continuum, depending on the complexity and importance of the decision. So the decision to order lunch is going to be have a much lower threshold for capacity than the decision to enroll in a randomized clinical trial of a monoclonal antibody for the treatment of Alzheimer's. And decisional capacity can also fluctuate from day to day depending on one's medical and neurologic state. And I think that we've all seen examples. Many participants with neurologic or psychiatric diseases had either impaired, fluctuating, or entirely non-existent capacity to engage in informed consent processes. But the principle of informed consent requires provision of accurate information about purpose, methods, risks, benefits, and alternatives, and an uncoerced decision by a participant with decision-making capacity. So, looking at our 7 principles, there's an obvious risk of violation of the principle of informed consent when dealing with individuals with impaired cognition. So, you would then turn to think about methods to mitigate or eliminate this risk. One important set of tools are capacity screening tools, which have been developed and validated, and can and should be used whenever study inclusion criteria encompasses participants with disorders that potentially result in cognitive impairment, whether permanent or fluctuating cognitive impairment. The results of these screening instruments should be confirmed by a qualified clinician. When impaired decision-making capacity is detected and precludes direct fulfillment of the requirements for informed consent, legally authorized representatives can make the decision on the participant's behalf. So the 2017 amendment to the Common Rule dictates that where local state law does not specify rules for surrogate decision-making about research surrogates, surrogates for medical decision-making can make clinical research decisions on behalf of participants. And that is the case in most states. I can't speak for your state in particular, and I would encourage you to review this individually for the states where you're conducting clinical research, but for the majority of states, those who are accepted as legally authorized representatives for the purposes of clinical decision making can also make decisions around clinical research. Surrogates should be using substituted judgment, so they should be making decisions as best they can as the participant themselves would make the decision if they had capacity, rather than as the surrogate would make the decision to the best of their ability. They're trying to make the decision as the participant would make it. IRBs may, in some cases, require additional safeguards. In cases where a surrogate is making the informed consent decision, a common example would be independent consent monitors who particularly review cases where a surrogate is making the decision to participate on behalf of a participant who lacks decision-making capacity. One very important caveat that has come up, I know, for at least one participant in the course this week is the exemption from informed consent, or EFIC. So in emergency settings, where time constraints prohibit informed consent process with a legally authorized representative, where the research cannot otherwise be conducted, where there's a possibility of direct benefit to the participant, and where there is prior consent from community representatives, IRBs may grant an exception from informed consent, EFIC. This typically requires prior consultation with an education for the entire community or community representatives of the community in which the research is being conducted. And so if we have enough time, I want to talk about one more application of these principles, and it's sort of a commonly encountered ethical issue. And that's the replication crisis, which I think has already come up and been discussed in a prior talk. So as was mentioned, the replication crisis is the fact that many peer-reviewed and widely cited studies demonstrating statistically significant results cannot be replicated by other researchers. There's been a lot of attention to this issue from the NIH and from researchers. So one study found that half of statistically significant results could not replicate even when the original researchers were granted review and approval of the replication protocol, and when significantly larger sample sizes than the original studies were used. One key contributor to the replication crisis has historically been publication bias, and specifically the selective publication of positive studies, or studies in which there's a statistically significant positive primary outcome. So looking at our 7 principles of social value, scientific validity, fair participant selection, favorable risk-benefit ratio, independent review, informed consent, and respect for enrolled and potential participants, and pretty clearly the replication crisis is going to represent at least a potential violation of the first and second principles of social value and scientific validity. A system of clinical research that produces consistently biased results is going to lack scientific validity. That lack of scientific validity is going to diminish the potential to improve human health or increase society's knowledge of human biology, and hence diminish the social value of that research. And these violations of ethical principles undermine the ethical justification for the social resources devoted to that research, and especially for the risks undertaken by the participants in that research. And so the NIH and other organizations have taken significant action to mitigate these ethical violations. Since 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services and the NIH has required all NIH-funded clinical trials, excluding phase 1 trials and feasibility studies, to be pre-registered with clinicaltrials.gov, to have results reported in a timely manner. I believe that's within 1 year of the last patient, last visit. I think that was discussed in a prior lecture. The AAN endorses that rule and more broadly recommends that pre-registration of both interventional and observational studies be considered when feasible, regardless of the funding source. So not requiring, but recommending at least consideration of pre-registration more broadly, including for the feasibility studies that some of us may be conducting. Publication bias can be detected and reduced through comparison of published studies with protocols. And so the AAN recommends and the NIH requires, although I think there's some state of flux going on right now, that when feasible, There should be open sharing of protocols, data, statistical analyses, and results in publicly accessible repositories. The AAN endorses use of peer-reviewed checklists for reporting studies, including the consort checklist for clinical trials, the strobe checklist for observational studies. Many publications now require the use of these checklists for publication. The AAN also endorses supplementing or replacing reported p-values with measures of effect size or association and measures of uncertainty, such as 95% confidence intervals, particularly when statistical analyses do not pre-specify methods to adjust for multiple tests. And finally, the AAN endorses funding and publication of replication studies. So with that, I want to wrap up and sort of highlight 3 takeaway points that I hope you'll remember from this talk. First, unlike healthcare providers, clinical researchers have a dual and potentially conflicting ethical obligations, both to their participants and to society and the beneficiaries of their research on the other hand. Second, that the foundational text of clinical research ethics, such as the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, and the Common Rule, give rise to 7 principles for the ethical analysis of clinical research. And these are, again, social value, scientific validity, fair participant selection, favorable risk-benefit ratio, independent review, informed consent, and respect for enrolled and potential participants. And I put in, as I mentioned, a citation that you can use to support references to these principles if you're in discussion with your IRB or with funders. And these 7 principles can be applied to analyze and develop mitigation strategies for ethical problems in clinical research, such as the replication crisis and participants with impaired decision-making capacity. And with that, thank a large multidisciplinary team that's involved in this work, and thank again the organizers and Robin for leading the work that was discussed in this talk, and you guys for your time and attention. And a special thank you to Dorothy, Natalie, and Zach. That all sucks.
Ben, that was great and really important information. I think that we don't always emphasize in this course, but appreciate you joining us. Does anybody have any questions for Ben?
Thank you. That was fantastic, Ben. So a question, and actually Roger and I were talking about this at lunch yesterday. So for those of us who do a lot of work in rare diseases, we've got a little bit of a problem, and this has been discussed a lot in the literature, about how we're supposed to consider our N of 1 treatments, particularly for ultra rare diseases. And I know this impacts some of the students in the course. So, you know, we go by these principles that were established for some very good reasons, but if you go strictly by the word, then we cannot report any of our N of 1 studies. We can't report N of 1 studies. We can do N of 1, you know, approved by FDA research, clinical care, but we can't report any of it because it can't be called research. So where has there been discussion with within AAN about what to do with either the ultra rare or the really rare? We're not talking about like Duchenne's where there's a ton of kids. We're talking about the ultra rares.
Yeah.
Where is this discussion going?
So I'm not aware of discussion within the ethics committee of the AAN, although I think that would be an interesting proposal for, you know, a more specific, narrowly tailored position statement from the Ethics, Law, and Humanities Committee at the AAN, because I think it is an important topic and one that has been receiving a growing attention and where there's a growing need. Generally speaking, what I would say is, I think there is a recognition among the medical ethics community that these 7 principles are a starting point, and that there are going to be times where they come into conflict, right? So, like in this case, I would suggest that, you know, the principle of social value is going to be significantly undermined if there's simply no research in ultra rare disease, right? There's going to be this entire subpopulation that is going to not benefit from the clinical research enterprise. And so, you know, I think that it's important to look not just at a single principle in isolation, but to look at the balance of the principles. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that the significant social cost of shutting down, research on rare diseases may outweigh other limitations, and may warrant a modification or adjustment of other limitations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, but let me sharpen it just a
Sure.
little bit. It's not so much research on rare diseases, that's going to happen either way. But we had a series of episodes that were reported in the AAN newspaper, rag sheet, whatever you want to call it, a couple of years ago, where there were adverse outcomes in rare gene therapy trials. There's a specific company that did not report these adverse events because there's no obligation to report an adverse event except to, I guess, FDA. But the word didn't get out, and other people were doing similar trials at the same time. And this resulted in what could be construed as excess fatalities, because and there's a whole, it's a very, very complicated scenario. Those of you who know, if you know, you know kind of thing. But it's reporting, it's learning from our experience.
Yeah.
And if it can't be called research, particularly with clinical experience in treatment, that's a real problem. So anyway, I know it affects some of the folks in the group here. I don't want to hog up the microphone because I think Roger wanted to add something.
So first a comment, then a question. The comment has to do with one of the 7 principles, which is that the risk balance has to be acceptable at the level of the individual participant. It's a little bit it contradicts a little bit the fact that the primary purpose of research is not the benefit of the individual. And there's also research that we do, like phase 1 research, first in human, where the benefit is to the class of people potentially affected with a disease. The benefit actually doesn't accrue at the individual level. So I think that principle is often violated the way it was written there, and I think it's your point about this weighing the societal benefit, and that these things aren't absolute rules, if that's fair.
I think that is fair, and as I mentioned, I think that principle is perhaps the most controversial and hotly debated of these 7 principles, and I think you are right that there are instances where it's fair to say that that rule is bent or even broken, and these principles were originally offered as necessary and sufficient for ethical clinical research. That was Zeke Emanuel's sort of initial statement on these principles. I think that is a little bit simplistic, as you're pointing out. I think it is important as we balance and compare competing instances of the sort of like more well-known 4 principles of clinical practice. You can't always perfectly uphold autonomy and beneficence in clinical practice. I think any of us who are clinicians are aware that these sometimes come into conflict, and we have to balance and trade off. I think that is also true within the principles of clinical research ethics. I think it's a good starting place, but there are going to be instances, as you're pointing out, where one of the principles is going to come into conflict with another, and you're going to have to make trade-offs. And I think that
I think phase 1 research, the traditional one, where you're just trying to figure out whether there are toxicities. You actually traditionally do phase 1 in unaffected individuals and healthy controls. There's no
who
question.
Have no benefit.
There's absolutely
right.
No benefit.
I completely agree. That is a violation.
Now my real question. I'm just going to try to move it along. So one of the things that the Belmont report did, which made perfect sense at the time and in the historical context, was create this very strong division between clinical research and clinical care. And I know I've talked to some of you about this, but as we're trying to integrate clinical research and care, and we're trying to generate in a pragmatic and efficient way answers that actually apply to the care of patients in routine clinical settings, I think that distinction sometimes works against us. And the specific thing I want you to comment on, if you can, is consent burden. So, you know, if we all have a medical condition for which we need hospital care, and we go to different hospitals or get different providers, or maybe the same provider on different days, we may get differences in the way the care is provided. And because that occurs in the context of clinical care, by Belmont is totally fine. It may be unsupported by evidence, it may ultimately be found to be harmful, but as long as the intent was just to take care of you, we're all good. But if we do the exact same thing but manipulate the treatments, as I talked about in an embedded clinical trial, where you randomly assign those things for which there's no evidentiary base to support one or the other, or there's clinical base lack of equipoise, so there's community variation. Now you're doing research, and because of the potential conflict identified in Belmont that you pointed out, now we have to have all of those elements of informed consent. I'm exaggerating a little bit. And now we're no longer able to enroll a representative patient population because of that additional benefit. So we lose the representativeness, we lose the applicability of the research result, which is also an ethical principle, to the target population. So I'm just wondering if some of the rigid thinking of Belmont is maybe now not serving us quite as well, and there needs to be some room for more flexibility and sort of fit for purpose, like Nancy Cass has talked about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think my initial thought, and I think that there's sort of different ways of approaching this. My initial thought would be that I think the principle of informed consent, when rigidly applied, can be very undermining of other ethical principles. So I think when we the modern informed consent procedures can be extremely burdensome for researchers and for participants, and can actually undermine the ability of vulnerable populations to participate in research. So I actually think there's like a real need to rethink the way we handle informed consent, to expedite it, and to make it less legalistic and more consistent with actual human psychology. So I think that that's an area where there's going to have to be significant reform and improvement. I think the current process has been demonstrated in studies to have very poor outcomes. Like the ability of participants who have gone through the informed consent process to actually relate the risks and benefits of the study is notoriously terrible. So it's not really working. And yet it is impeding research, it's impeding the ability of participants to participate in research, it's impeding the ability of researchers to conduct research, as you're pointing out. And so I think there's a real need for reform there. That would be sort of my approach, is sort of like rethinking how we instantiate the principle of informed consent.
Okay.